Hi, I'm Larry Powell. Welcome to Planet in Peril, a production of Nipo Access Community Television. First, a heads up. My lead story deals with famine, so you may find some of the images disturbing. The famine in parts of Africa and the Middle East is being described as the worst hunger crisis in the world. But finally, a bit of good news is emerging. The Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, now credits a big boost in humanitarian aid to South Sudan with rescuing many from the brink of imminent death from starvation. But if that aid does not keep coming, it warns, the crisis will surely deepen once again. Here and elsewhere, aid agencies, including the FAO, are on the ground offering life-giving help to the victims. In Nigeria, seeds are being distributed to help the millions still struggling to find food and the tens of thousands facing outright starvation. Here, too, access to humanitarian aid is said to be improving. So while this may be helping the most desperate, there are still more people struggling to find food than there were just a few months ago. In Somalia, over 3 million are said to be on the knife edge of hunger. FAO veterinarians have been treating sick and weakened livestock, which otherwise may die, depriving families of their milk and meat. And Yemen, a small Arab nation, is in dire need as well. There, a protracted humanitarian crisis of enormous scale, which includes war, a scourge of crop-eating locusts, and the worst cholera outbreak in the world, has left perhaps 20 million without enough to eat. The reasons for all of this are many and varied. Armed conflict persists in many places. Lawless groups are forcing millions to flee or keeping farmers from working their fields. Sometimes high food prices just add to the problems. And here's what the FAO itself has to say about the role that man-made climate change plays here. In recent years, droughts have resulted in some of the most high-profile humanitarian disasters, including the crises in the Horn of Africa in 2011 and in the Sahel in 2012, disasters which threatened the lives of millions of people. In the past, droughts were not always so disastrous and are often part of a regular climate cycle. However, the greater frequency of droughts and more erratic nature of rains in many countries, combined with underlying economic, social, and environmental vulnerabilities, have meant that droughts have an increasingly destructive impact on at-risk populations. In this short video, the FAO tells us more about the terrible cost of drought.
Droughts have been a scourge on our planet throughout the ages, hitting people where it hurts most by depriving them of food and water. They are a devastating natural disaster, causing over 11 million deaths since the 1900s and affecting a further 2 billion people. Droughts also hurt economies, costing an estimated $6 to $8 billion every year and threatening gains in food security and poverty reduction. Much of the damage is done to agriculture, which bears up to 80% of the economic cost of droughts in developing countries. Africa is particularly vulnerable. Between 2005 and 2014, there were 84 droughts in 30 countries across the continent. In 2017, droughts continue to hit countries such as Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia. Climate change is already intensifying droughts and increasing their frequency across the globe. The traditional response of providing emergency assistance is not enough. To meet the Sustainable Development Goals, the world needs to move faster from a crisis-led response to a proactive approach that reduces impacts, builds resilience, and allows people to cope with drought. Integrated soil and water management practices can conserve soil moisture, and allow some food production to continue in droughts. Connecting vulnerable farmers to information and technologies such as early warning systems, drought-tolerant seeds, and water efficiency tools can help plan and prepare. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development provides an opportunity to make proactive disaster risk reduction an integral part of efforts to meet these targets. FAO works on increasing the resilience of livelihoods to threats and crises. Everyone has a role to play, from the policy to the community level, to avoid drought becoming famines and to ensure no one is left behind.
So we all know that extreme heat can kill crops and livestock by spawning frequent and prolonged drought. But it can also kill us more directly by pushing our bodies beyond human endurance. A new study in Nature Climate Change tries to put numbers on how many of us are already being threatened in this way and how many might be in the future. At the moment, it's believed that about 30% of the world population faces for at least 20 days a year heat extremes that can be deadly for humans. Even if we drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that number will still jump to almost 50% by 2100. And if that drastic reduction does not happen at all, it jumps again to almost 75%. And this recent report from Environment Canada shows we are not exempt from such trends in this country either. Hot days and warm nights are expected to become more common in many Canadian cities, including Winnipeg. Residents there and elsewhere can expect to see the number of days with temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius double between now and the end of the century. And the latest news from the World Meteorological Organization is not encouraging, as we see in this very recent video.
Parts of Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and the USA have seen very, very high May and June temperatures. The heat waves are unusually early, and they are occurring in the context of the Earth experiencing yet another exceptionally hot year.
When we cross a threshold, which is defined by a local condition, then we call for heat wave. For example, Switzerland, the threshold of heat wave is 30 degrees centigrade. So when we cross that threshold, there is an issue of warning or advisory. Heat waves are part of natural variability in most of the case, but the extremity and the frequency of occurrence of heat waves have been evidenced in the last 10 years are increasing. This is because of the background climate change and long-term warming.
Next up are two programs I produced for my blog planetinperil.ca on the topic of rising sea levels, in this case how they're impacting Atlantic Canada. This will be a little different. The second one is a regular video, but the first is a podcast, which means sound but no picture, audio only. So it's like listening to the radio. So pretend for the next few minutes that's what you're doing. And I think you'll agree the message is an important one. I'm calling these two programs Angry Oceans. Hi, I'm Larry Powell. Welcome to a new series of podcasts on planetinperil.ca about our angry oceans. Predictions surrounding rising sea levels around the world and the threat they pose to millions of coastal dwellers are sounding more and more ominous. This was evident as a panel of leading experts held a recent online event called a webinar. It was hosted by the Science Media Centre of Canada and moderated by Brigitte Nayan.
Sea levels are on the rise, but they will not rise at equal levels throughout the world. As the climate changes and the planet warms, rising sea levels are now becoming one of the greatest threats to the world's populations. The latest research published just 2 weeks ago shows rises in sea levels will double the frequency of severe coastal flooding in most of the world, with dire consequences for major cities that sit on coastlines, including those in Canada. The social and political fallout of displaced populations could prove to be one of the greatest challenges for future generations. According to a recent study in Nature, more than 13 million Americans will lose their homes to sea level rise by the end of this century, and Canada could face a similar fate. When you hear about the global impacts from one of our panelists, 13 million might sadly begin to sound like a few drops in the ocean when it comes to how many will be affected. The repercussions of rising sea levels will challenge the way countries make planning decisions about climate change.
Adam Fennick directs the Climate Lab at the University of Prince Edward Island. In a visual presentation, he told the webinar many experts now fear that sea levels could rise by between 2 meters and 2.6 meters by century's end. That's way more than predicted just a few years ago. Dr. Fennick warns that some of the higher sea level rise predictions anywhere are for much of the eastern seaboard of North America, and that includes his home, PEI, and Atlantic Canada.
How important is it to Prince Edward Island? Well, this yellow arrow is pointing to Emmett McKenna's property. Back in 1959, he purchased 3 acres from his uncle for $55 an acre, and now it's completely underwater. So almost during my lifetime, people on Prince Edward Island have had waterfront property that's now completely underwater, both from a combination of sea level rise as well as coastal erosion. We conducted a study a few years ago that looked at the coastline. We looked at every single meter of Prince Edward Island from the year 1968 to 2010. And if you took that thin strip of change in the coasts between those time periods and added them all up, you could see that overall there was over 35 square kilometers land that was eroded or lost. There was almost 15 square kilometers that were gained. And overall there was a net loss of 20 square kilometers. That's about 5,000 acres. That's about half the size of Charlottetown. So the island's not going anywhere fast. Under those rates of erosion, it's going to take 10,000 years for Prince Edward Island to completely disappear. But it is the most important part of PEI. Everybody loves to be close to the shoreline. There's a lot of infrastructure that's close to the shoreline. So when we look at all those meter changes that I talked about between 68 and 2010, and when we looked at the average change that happens, we multiplied that by 30, 60, and 90 years just to get a sense of what type of infrastructure is going to be vulnerable. Now, we all think that the rates of erosion are going to increase because the sea levels are increasing. The land itself is falling a little bit. We're getting more storms in terms of frequency, in terms of magnitude. But just under current rates of erosion, things that we've seen over the last 40 years or so, there's at least 1,000 homes and cottages that are threatened. Are vulnerable. We have 17 lighthouses. One of them is actually half in the water already. We even have wind turbines. Things that we've put in the last 10 years or so are vulnerable to coastal erosion. I think the big message is let's not build so darn close to the shore.
Hi, welcome to Angry Oceans, my second in a series of reports on planetinperil.ca. Once again, we're focusing on storm surges and sea level rise, and how they're making storms like this even worse. Except this time, we'll provide you with a not-too-common glimpse into how this phenomenon is impacting our own country, in this case Prince Edward Island and Atlantic Canada. Surges happen when wind from a major storm drives the water inland, causing major flooding. While surges can be a big problem, especially at high tide, rising sea levels are adding a new and dangerous dimension. A series of 22 tidal gauges around Charlottetown have recorded a significant rise at PEI's capital of 50 centimeters or half a meter since 1910. So in the face of those rising levels, the storm surges no longer have to be as strong as they once were for major flooding to still occur. Natasha Bernier of Environment and Climate Change Canada, a specialist in wave and storm surge research, delivered that cautionary tale at a recent conference with other experts.
In terms of like day to day, when are the storm surges important? So the storm surges on the left column in red, if they happen at or near low tide, which is the second line in blue, they add up to create a total sea level, which is not very different than the overall, what you would usually expect from the overall range of tides in many areas. So people usually don't notice them when they happen at or near low tide. On the right-hand side, you've got the same storm, but this time it's happening at or near high tide, and so they add up then to elevate the total sea level. And if you have large enough storm surges at that point, you may push a total sea level beyond the flood line, which is in purple, which is shown in purple. So why is sea level rise an issue? Well, sea level rise and climate change, actually. So there's two things going on here. So if you look at the graph at the bottom, it's annual mean sea level from a tide gauge in Charlottetown, PEI. And so what I've done is I've just averaged the sea level from the tide gauge for every year. And you can see that sea level has been rising, give or take 50 centimeters over the past 110, 20 years of the record. So sea level is rising, which means that how big a storm surge needs to be in order to exceed the flood line, it's getting smaller and smaller with time. So this is, if you think of the previous storms we were talking about in the first slide, they were storms of amplitudes of 1 to 2 meters, but in general, storms of like 60 to even 80 centimeters in some areas, if they happen at or near high tide, they're the type of storms that we want to keep an eye on. And so if sea level continues to rise and these storms are getting smaller and smaller, then more of the storms are becoming something that you need to keep an eye out for. In addition to that, there's warming going on. And so with time, we're talking like decades here, the ice, how much ice there is in the Gulf is decreasing. And so in winter, because there is less ice, there's more fetch, the winds have more impact on the sea level, and so they can cause larger waves event, and they combine to the storm surge. And so you have an added effect of the waves on the storm surges that increase the risk.
Dr. Adam Fennick of the University of Prince Edward Island spoke at the same event. The Nobel Prize-winning academic reminded his audience that Atlantic Canada is in line for some of the highest sea level rises anywhere in the world, perhaps more than 2.5 meters by 2100. He brought his point home with this dramatic visual presentation looking at impacts of these changes on the island.
As I'm going to show you now, you can raise the sea levels up to 2 meters. That might be a permanent sea level. In 100 years, we do get storm surges, don't hit the island all sides, but certain sides of the island might also feel some type of flooding that looks like this. So you can see how vulnerable, because it's a low-lying island. I'll quickly just go and show as well that we can click on and off the coastlines, so we can see in a very quick way where coastal erosion might impact if we're looking at annual rates of erosion that have happened over the last 40 years, and we just look into the future over the next 30, 60, and 90 years.
That's all for this edition of our program. We hope you found it informative. And for more stories like this, please visit my blog, planetinperil.ca. And we hope to see you again soon on Nipawin Access Community TV. Bye for now.